Hey everybody, Jake here from Bearded Gear, and I've got a first impressions video to do for you on this beautiful new knife. I just opened this up yesterday. I've had it, I think, probably like 22 hours if I'm being real specific, but this knife has either been in pocket the entire time, or it's been in my hand and I've been fidgeting with it the entire time, or I've been asleep. Those are the only options. It's either been in my pocket, in my hand, or I've literally been sleeping, because it is so fantastic on first impressions. Obviously, my full review will come after about a week with this knife, like I always do. I do not want to be the kind of guy who gives you a full review after only having this knife for such a brief period, but I want to talk about this knife because I am already so excited by it and enamored with it. It's just a really, really great knife. This, of course, is the Protech Malibu, and specifically, it is the Protech Malibu with the Reverse Tanto blade shape. This is the second variant of this knife to become available. I saw this knife first when it was a prototype on Protech's Instagram, and they showed it with the Wharncliffe kind of side by side with the pre-production versions of this knife. They had a few photos that they shared of those knives, and I knew pretty much immediately that the blade shape I preferred aesthetically was this one, the Reverse Tanto. I think it just looks fantastic. A Reverse Tanto is a lot like a sheep's foot, and I love sheep's foot blades, and I find that they're very useful. We'll get into that, but this one just became available. The Wharncliffe one has been available for a little while, although I believe almost everywhere, if not everywhere that has had it, has sold out, and they're waiting for the next production run of them, because it became very popular very quick, and for so many good reasons. So this one is the new blade shape. I believe dealers are about to start getting these. I was very lucky that Protech was willing to let me get one straight from them so that I could have it a little early and begin sharing it with you guys. That way people can be prepared as they're beginning to drop here in the very near future. But let's talk a little bit about this knife and its features and its function. And I can't really talk about this knife without, I guess I could if I really tried, but I'm not going to, without talking about the Protech Mordax, which I had before this knife. The Protech Mordax was a collaboration between Protech Knives, Ferrum Forge, and Mass Drop, now known as just Drop. And so what happened was Protech used a design from Ferrum Forge, the Mordax design, and they created a button lock flipper, same mechanism as this knife, and then it was sold exclusively through Drop. So that's kind of a complicated relationship there. It worked well, don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with the way that one happened, but this one is all Protech. This is Protech's internal design, this is their knife, they make it, they sell it, and the retailers that they sell through sell it. So this, I was immediately excited about when I saw that it was coming, because I already had a Mordax, and the Mordax was a super fun knife. The action between the Mordax and this knife, to me, feel about identical. The only difference would be the weight and shape of the blade, and the ergos of the handle tend to make an action maybe feel slightly different because of hand placement and how much weight is flinging out, etc. But in terms of the way the detent functions, the way the button lock functions, the way the flipper actuates, it's just like the Mordax, and that is high praise, because the Mordax was one of the most fidget friendly knives I've ever owned, and it was fantastic. The only reason why I sold my Mordax is because I knew this was coming soon and I wanted to get one of these, and I knew that I probably wouldn't need or carry both. Would I like to have both? Yeah, maybe one day I'll get another Mordax, but I will say, for me, already right now, just having this for a day, this is the better knife in actual application for me. That's for my hands and my preferences. So keep all of what I'm going to say in mind, that this is my opinion and my experience with it thus far. I'm not saying objectively this is a better knife than the Mordax, but for me and my application with a button lock, aluminum scale, 20 CV blade, EDC folder, this is a better size and shape for me. So We've got aluminum scales that are hard coat anodized black, and they've got this really nice matte tone to them. You can see there's no real shine to these, although they almost have like the slightest bit of a metallic-y tone. It's really nice. It's a great metallic finish, and it's like silky smooth when you're light on it. When I just like feather touch it, it feels very smooth, but when you press down on it, it actually gives a good amount of traction. It's not slick when you're bearing down on the knife, which is important on handle scales. I don't need like super traction-y materials. In fact, lately I'm finding I prefer pretty smooth materials for handle scales, but it can't be so slick that it's like a safety concern either. There has to be a balance there. And this is a great finish where, without having to mill in texture or add a G10 scale on top of these or anything crazy, they're able to just use the anodizing to create an excellent texture on the knife. So I really, really dig that. The only jimping that you'll find on this knife is going to be on the flipper tab, and then technically, I guess you could call this jimping, although it's all recessed. This is under the level of the rest of the scales. So when you have this knife in your hand, I cannot tell that that exists there. I guess in reverse grip, nope, not even then. I can't tell that that jimping is there. So for me, I adore that they didn't put jimping on the spine. They didn't put jimping in the finger groove. They didn't put jimping back here. There's no unnecessary jimping anywhere. And when you don't need jimping, why put it somewhere? This knife doesn't need jimping. So that's really, really good. Let's talk about the shape of the handle, because it looks pretty simple. Like if you're looking at this handle, and when I've seen it in photos, even looking at it in person, it's a fairly neutral shape. So it should accept a lot of hands, but sometimes shape that accepts a lot of hands doesn't feel good for any hands. Like one size fits most, fits all poorly a lot of the time. So for me, these ergos are really good, like really good. I wear a medium glove, but I joke that I fill it out really well. I don't have very large hands, and for me, oh my goodness, it's great. Of the Protechs I've owned, which it's only been a couple, I've had the Mordax, I had an SBR, I had one of the Strider PT Protech auto versions. There's at least one that I'm forgetting, but of all the Protechs I've owned, and I've never had struggles with Protechs ergonomically, this one's the best. The biggest way that it wins out over the Mordax for me is these ergos, and then secondarily also its profile and the size of its carry, but we'll get to that as well. So ergos are, I'm really, really loving them. Unless something changes or jumps out at me that I'm somehow not noticing, these ergos are just so good. The pocket clip is fantastic as well. I can feel it in my hand, but it's not sharp, it's not annoying. It just rests in a very convenient spot in my hand, kind of right here, and it works great. Also, the way that Protech does pocket clips should become the standard, in my opinion. This is a loop over deep carry clip, which is my favorite type of pocket clip. I almost always prefer deep carry. I just find it better for the way that I carry knives. And then you'll notice that the screws in here are flat screws. They're not rounded. And the clip has been given a perfect slot to seat into. So the clip is seated into a slot so that it sits flush with the rest of the scale, and then the screws are countersunk in there so that they sit flush with everything. So when you're putting this knife into your pocket, there is no chance of snagging at all on the screws and the bottom tab of the clip or anything like that, which is not the case on most knives. Usually there is the base of the clip itself, and then there's screws sitting on top of that. So you've got like layers of like steps coming up underneath your pocket clip, which is not ideal when you're sliding a knife into your pocket. So the way that they've done this is just perfection. This is one of the best examples of a pocket clip ever in my experience and in my opinion. I adore the way that they've done this pocket clip. And Protech does this on a lot of their knives. It's not just this model that's getting it. From what I've seen, it's pretty standard at this point. So big win for the pocket clip. It's also a really classy pocket clip. in this finish. I believe this is a titanium clip. I'd have to double check, but I'm 98% certain. It's a nice satin finish, which matches the satin hardware, the satin button. It looks great to me. So, pocket clip, handle scales, huge win. They're also, you can see, I don't know if you can tell, but there's no internal milling or anything. But these being aluminum, this is not a heavy knife. And the balance feels really good, handle to blade. It's very nice and in a nice neutral position. So it balances right about where my finger goes, just barely towards the butt. But it makes the blade feel very neutral in hand. It doesn't feel front heavy. It doesn't feel back heavy. It just feels, oh, it's great. So I think that's about it for the handle. While we're here, since the button is on the handle, let's talk about this locking mechanism, because this is a button lock. When a lot of people see Protechs, myself included, and you see that button, you probably assume it's a push button auto, because most Protechs are push button autos. This one is not. Protech is a group of geniuses, because the way that this detent functions with a button lock, I mentioned this in my unboxing because it feels identical to what I experienced on the Mordax. I don't know what magic sauce they use to make it happen. I'm not an engineer, so I'm not going to try to explain it, how it works. But what they've done is they've made a button lock with a proper, crisp, fantastic detent. It is one of the best detents on any flipper that I've used, button lock or not. Just so crisp, so reliable. The sounds it makes, the sensation it gives, the way it breaks, it is a phenomenal detent. And usually, on most other button locks I've experienced, and many other button locks I've watched reviews of, so I'll have to take other people's word on, it's not usually, it's very uncommon to have a button lock with a solid, crisp, good detent. It's just, it works so well here. So I don't know how they're doing it. Again, I'm sure you can learn. I'm sure somebody can explain that, but it's magical to me. And I'd prefer to leave it magic, frankly. Some things are great when you don't have to understand them. You can just enjoy them. And this, oh, it's such a good detent. I can't get enough of playing with this knife. You might notice when I close it, there's a little bit of a ting some of the time. That's if I'm not applying pressure to the pocket clip, because the way this titanium clip rides on the aluminum, it just barely, I don't know if you can, it like has just the littlest bit of rattle when the acoustics are just right. But a lot of the time when I'm playing with the action, I'm on the pocket clip anyways. So when that's the case, you don't hear it. But something worth noting, I suppose. Doesn't bother me one bit because I know exactly what it is that's rattling, and it's just the pocket clip against the scale. So, action, incredible. Ergos, really, really good. The blade, let's talk about. So this one is in 20 CV, which of the steels that Protech works with is probably my favorite that I'm aware of that they work with, at least. And also just in general, it's one of my favorite steels. CPM 20 CV is an excellent super steel in today's market. Is it my favorite steel in the world? No. But will I ever complain in 2020 about having 20 CV on a knife? No. I think it is the standard for high-end knives. And that's where I would put this, is a high-end knife. Not ultra high-end, it's not custom or anything like that, but this is a nice American-made folder. So 20 CV is welcome on here. I dig it. I also love that they put the stamping on the flipper tab. See if I can get that to focus. I don't know if it will. CPM 20 CV. I don't know if you can see that. I'm trying. Anyway, it's right there. I love that because oftentimes you get all this billboarding on a blade where on this side it'll say Protech, and then over here it'll say CPM 20 CV and maybe the model name or something like that, the number if it's numbered. And here you'll notice there's none of that. We've got the blade stamped here, and then what they've done is they've laser etched the spine, which I think is a way better place to put all of that information. I think it's great. So when I did the unboxing, I realized that this said number 2 on it. I didn't know at that time if that meant that I had literally number 2 of this production run, or if it meant like this is blade shape number 2. I didn't want to get too excited. Turns out I legitimately actually have number 2 of this production run, which is awesome. So production run 1, number 2. That is really cool. I could technically only have one number lower than that. That's one less than as good as it gets. That's really, really cool to me. So thank you so much to Protech for sending this one to me of all the ones you could have sent to me. That's really, really rad. Anyway, we've got 20 CV, and obviously it's a reverse Tanto. So a reverse Tanto, I think, is an excellent blade shape for EDC. Let me explain why by showing you how this blade actually functions. We have a nice, very, very gradual curve the whole way along the blade. It's almost flat, but it's got the tiniest bit of belly. That's a very good thing. Belly helps with slicing, but too much belly, like really abrupt belly, like I sometimes call it, can be problematic, I find, in certain types of cutting. This, for EDC tasks, for going through soft to medium to some hard materials, is going to be very good for slicing. Also, the profile, the way they've ground this, it's flat ground with a reasonable flat up at the top, but I'd say it's like, I don't know, 70-30%. 70% of the blade is flat grind, and then we've got a flat up above it. Anyways, this flat bevel is done really well. From what I understand, they actually updated this from, I don't know whether it was the pre-production or even the Wharncliffe, but they let me know that they did update the grinds to make this even thinner behind the edge, which I'll say, this is not like a supremely thin behind the edge knife. I've certainly felt thinner, but for an all-around 20 CV blade steel EDC kind of like user knife, where I think they're trying to position this in its philosophy of use, I think this grind is excellent. It's totally reasonably thin. It will slice very well, and I've already put it through, I don't know, I probably cut like 10 feet of cardboard consistently, like making push cuts through on different surfaces of the blade just to see how it did, and it was excellent. Absolutely fantastic, really good. Now, the other good thing about a reverse Tanto is sometimes on like a sheep's foot or even some Wharncliffes, like on a Wharncliffe, oftentimes you get a spindly tip, but on a sheep's foot, you don't really get a tip. Whereas on this knife, you get an awesome, perfectly robust tip. That's a tip that I'm not really worried about at all. And it still has a fantastic piercing point. Like, to pierce into material to begin cutting, or whatever you need to pierce into a material for, this is a fantastic tip. It's really, really good and comes to an excellent point. So for stabbing type tasks, this knife is going to do great, but it also provides a very good cutting edge with that nice gradual curve all the way along it. And then you've got a nice straight spine, which I think looks clean. I like that they didn't mess with adding like a swedge on here or anything. I want to say the pre-production, like the prototype model, did have a swedge. I like it better how clean it looks like this. I actually really dig how sterile this blade is. And I think that was a specific part of their design philosophy on this knife, is making it purposely simple, but just dialing everything in and like nailing it. They're not doing anything extra on this knife. There's nothing funky happening, but they've really just taken the time to make sure that every component of it is really well thought out, feels great, functions great, and it came together so well. I'm finding lately I've been crushing on a lot of knives that nail simplicity. Because there's a lot of things in today's market that, in order to sell, I think, companies are just putting these extra frills on and design features, and it can be a lot of fun to have things like that, don't get me wrong, but there's something about just dialing in your basics and putting together a knife like this that so far is just astounding me at how fun it is to play with, how good it feels in hand, how well it cuts, how nice it is in pocket. The profile of this is fantastic. I don't know if I even talked about that. The way this sits in pocket, it's really comfortable. I had this in basketball shorts for like 4 hours last night, and I was literally like forgetting it was in my pocket while I was on the couch, and I'd roll over and like not even feel it there. It's crazy. It's really comfortable in pocket. It's a totally reasonable weight. I would call this lightweight for its size and for the materials used. yeah, I'm really, really, really liking this. And I'm sure a lot of you who are watching this have probably already seen people do reviews of the Wharncliffe version and rave about that one. And so I imagine most of what I just said has already been said of this knife, just with the other blade shape. But this blade shape, my goodness, it's fantastic. I really, really like it. I think this knife came together so well, and I am looking forward to, over the next week, might be a little more than a week with how many knives I have right now, but just having this in pocket so much and cutting things with it and experiencing it. I will, by the time that I'm done with that review, also do a head-to-head between this knife and the Benchmade 940. I've seen a lot of people make comparisons between these two, and I have a 940 that I'm borrowing right now to kind of test drive and use, and so I'm going to be figuring out whether the claims that some people are making that this is kind of a 940 killer, how much weight there is to that. And I'm not going to spoil anything yet because I haven't done enough of the testing to really have a firm opinion on it. But that is going to be an interesting video, I think, because we've got two reverse Tantos with aluminum scales and button lock, axis lock. They're somewhat similar. There's similarities between these two knives, so that'll be fun. But anyway, this has been a long first introduction, first impressions. I apologize for rambling so much, but those of you who are excited about this knife, I hope that you enjoyed watching it, and those of you who are hoping to get one, happy hunting when they do drop. But this is the Protech Malibu in a reverse Tanto, and it's actually number 2, which is dope. Thanks again to Protech for sending this along. Really appreciate the guys over there, and there's plenty more to come on this guy.